Okay, well, morning everybody and welcome to this session. I'm Bob Nowill. I'm looking after the session during the course of the morning. We got some really good things lined up. Obviously, the very first session you can already see the speakers, but I encourage you to stay for as long as you possibly can. I know we've got competing rooms. We're going to kick off with bodies of knowledge. After that, we've got John and Peter on the ISP skills framework, which is such a topical issue. Really welcome lots of input on that one as well. Then we move on to diversity, and we finish off with the BCS on recent penetration testing research. So lots of interesting things in session 3. Because we'll be much smaller than the others and we're not a sort of amphitheatre like they are, please join in. We're building it as discussion as much as transmit. You'll see that the format, because we're now going to get going on that, but the format really is, apart from me saying a few words from time to time, the various panelists and speakers will say a few words, 5 or so minutes to put their case for whatever it is the subject is, after which we want some discussion. So do think of that. I'll try and pull that together as a proper discussion and chair it through, but just bear that in mind. So please be as proactive as you possibly can be. For the very first session then, you can see it up here on the screen, we thought it would be a good idea to start on bodies of knowledge, which is a very topical subject. Certainly in the IISP, back in GCHQ, CSG, NCSC, they have been thinking about this for a considerable period of time, as have all the other professional organisations and institutions that think about information security. So trying to set out what it is that professionals need, what it is professionals should know, and even if it's not all in a single head, a place you can go that signposts what it is we all are talking about, and the right vocabulary and the right quality of materials is what this is all about. And how should we in the institution put that together in the face of the fact that there are many other people thinking about it as well. So we've got a lot of initiatives in this area. Some of these initiatives are more mature than others. Certainly in the ISP, as you'll hear from John, we've been working hard on it latterly. And we are very interested in the views of people who are professional in this area to keep us on track. So how do we make sure that what we've all written down in something that can rapidly go stale and feel static, how can we be sure that we keep that dynamic and up to date? That's one of the major challenges that we're going to try and talk through today. So what I want to do now is just very quickly signpost who the team is. Each of the folks you can see over there will then do a few minutes on their subject, and then we'll get into the discussion. So we've got John Hughes next to me. We have David Zilberberg. Then we have Jim. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your surname, Jim. You tell me what it is. Hietala. Hietala from the Open Group, and Nigel Jones from IAAC, who is, as a typo in the thing, where it says IACC, he's IAAC. So we have a very, very strong panel. Many of you will know these people very well. And I'd like to kick off with John Hughes to say where his viewpoint is on this entire subject.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. I mean, the first thing to say is that the ISP value and recognise the value of a body of knowledge. And it's very important as we continue the trend to professionalise our particular industry. And one of the most important driving things about this is it is a requirement for a chartered institution, as chartered by the Privy Council, to actually have a body of knowledge. So as we progress to become a Royal Chartered institution, we need a body of knowledge. And the key requirement we established was we need to be able to link it to the ISP skills framework. That was very important that we had a linkage and we could expand upon the skills framework such that we could create the body of knowledge out of that skills framework. Now, to help us understand that, because there's a lot of misunderstandings what body of knowledge actually is. So we took a a little while to research what bodies of knowledge usually entailed. So I did a study and I looked at about 8 or 9 different bodies of knowledge in not exactly this field, but at least in either the IT or project management world. So I had a very good idea of what body knowledge would typically entail. And particularly I was looking at the objectives and the structure. And there were certain themes you could draw out upon that. But one thing we also recognised, taking the analysis into account, was that to create a single body of knowledge would be a massive amount of work. I mean, our industry covers lots of different skills, it covers lots of different roles, and trying to maintain a single monolithic document that would encompass everything that everyone ever knew would be very difficult and extremely difficult to maintain. So what we decided to do was build what we call a knowledge framework. So it's not a body of knowledge, but it's a knowledge framework. And a key point about this was it basically extended the skills framework and then would refer out to other documents. So it would refer out to standards, to other reference material, or even other bodies of knowledge. And that was a key thing we would refer out to. And if you actually look at lots of other bodies of knowledge in this sort of space, what they tend to do is they refer out to what they call topical references. And that's basically what we decided to build, was a knowledge framework that would spin out and refer out to other documents. Now, I'm not saying the body of knowledge is small, and you'll hear later on when Pete and I talk about it, I'll flesh out what the body of knowledge is. It is still a reasonable sized document, but one of the main things it does is it points out to a lot of topical references. And that's basically the work we're doing. So shortly after this session, we'll explain more about where we are with the body of knowledge.
Okay, thank you very much. Nigel.
Thanks. Yes, sorry about the typo. I hope it's not my fault. That would be awful. But, anyway, we've, as IAAC, run a short research program of late, and we've recently published in the reports on the website on what we call the profession, trying to understand the cybersecurity and information assurance, cyber risk, information risk, whatever we call our profession. And from that, we actually explored the topic in a wide variety of ways. Primarily, of course, we're trying to define what it was the profession is, how people understand it. We were assuming that this would involve some sort of body of knowledge, skills and attitudes that in some way would be represented and held and looked after by professional bodies. And of course, what we found was something that had coherence in some respects and fragmentation in other respects, as we tried to really tease out where the boundaries were between different disciplines of those that are involved. And that's in part what I wanted to talk about for a few minutes now. And I wanted to do it really by proposing a little bit of a challenge for us to think of as we go through. Imagine that on one hand I ask you to list the principles of security by design. Okay, now it'd be interesting to get into a huddle and see if we could come up with what those are, or where we were to refer to if we were going to do that. Okay, now listing, of course, as a skill and trying to show it is a relatively straightforward one. You know the principles and you list them, and you can see how you could be assessed and examined and be awarded a certificate in some way. It would maybe be right or wrong, and you could even do it as a multiple choice and make it more difficult by having a couple of the answers really similar. You know, the sort of tests that people do to get certificates. On the other hand, I could ask you to evaluate the deployment of a security architecture. Okay, now that's perhaps closer to many of your day jobs in terms of a skill that you actually have to do. We don't really go around being tested by people as to list these things. We're asked to evaluate and judge. And when you look at this from a cognitive educational perspective, you see that we'd expect people at an entry level in some way to be able to list and say what things are and know the facts, and people who are actually starting to become more competent being able to evaluate And so we can see growth in a person's ability to conduct various types of skills in an educational sense, and that feeds through into the profession. It would be a very poor professional, I think, who would evaluate the deployment of a security architecture if they didn't know what the principles were of security by design, even though we could perhaps agree that it might be difficult to pin those down as professionals today as to what exactly those are. So we've got a little bit of a tension in here. Okay, but if we put those skills in the context then of real life, why should I trust you with your evaluation and the way that you evaluate and with your report at the end that you deliver to me as a client? And that comes down to you being able to show that it's grounded in what you know, and it's grounded in what you can demonstrably do, and so on. And of course, you need the professional bodies and certification to be able to show that. And at the moment, we found in our profession that there was quite a bit of fragmentation about that, and it's not easy for clients to understand which of these they should go for. So I think there's something we need to address in that. Trying to have a single body that is the font of all knowledge for everything we do remains very problematic, though, because we found that we preferred the term of looking at information risk and information security as a profession of professions. In other words, there were people who were belonging to a range of professional bodies who had a role to play. Try to give an example of how you might look at these professions by using a grade A mnemonic or acronym to try and help people remember what it might be. So governors would be the start of the grade. Risk assessors and risk managers, auditors, defenders, which would consist of testers, operators, and so on. Engineers and architects would complete my grade A mnemonic or acronym. And you could see that, for instance, someone who really comes from an engineering background and looks at security as being a stream of what it is they do may find a home in a global environment of general engineering such as IET, and also home in IISP, and be a member of more than one body, and that wouldn't be inappropriate. You could see that in part they're an engineer and they've got a fellowship of engineers, and in part they're an information security specialist because they're engineering in that space. So I don't see a particular issue with that. But it did say to me that one body fitting everything was problematic, and it came to this knowledge. Another example of that would be if we took our security by design view. Well, my perspective, I came into the cyber area from the military, from an information warfare perspective. I looked at that as a socio-technical system. It was about what people decided to do on the basis of the information that was presented to them, on the systems that were either resilient under attack or whatever, degraded, and so on. So, and I came things from a human perspective. And what I understand in my part of the profession is that there's a body of knowledge that isn't common for many people. So, for instance, I understand what the difference between a content and a process theory of motivation is. I understand why awareness isn't enough when it comes to changing behavior. I know that there's things you can do in security by design to prompt people to act in the way that you would like them to. You can cue that behavior through that design. To what extent is that in our security by design principles that you were thinking of when I set that challenge to you before? Okay, so the issue there for me is that maybe some of the things I need to know are simply assumed, and see as a profession, are simply assumed by others who are expert in the human dimension simply being people. When in fact I see it as more than that. It's not enough simply to be a person to understand the human dimension. I mean, it's a good starting place, but there's an awful lot more to it, because actually so much about the world and the way we behave we assume, and we're very bad at attributing why things happen, okay, through our own biases, our own perceptions. I look at that as what I'm good at and what I'm a professional in, and there's a body of knowledge that goes with that, but I don't know if it's your body of knowledge, if you're in a different part of information security. So hopefully that's something for us to think about, or an exercise we can follow through in discussion about security by design.
Good. Thank you, Nigel.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm David Zilberberg from the ISSA, the Information System Security Association. I prepared a whole different intro for the day, but a lot of it been covered. and I don't see the point reiterating. So I think it's a good place to maybe just shed a word or two on ISSA. So what we do in ISSA in the UK, the focus is around getting people from the profession together. It is a networking type association. But we also have a lot of global initiatives. One of them is called the CSCL, Cybersecurity Career Lifecycle, which talks pretty much about the problems of body of knowledge, of how do I direct myself as an individual, so as an organization, to the route I'm trying to achieve. It's broken down into, it is mainly tailored around individuals. There is some materials designed for bodies, for organization, but it's around how can I take my career path, my route in this very confusing landscape, and the association is American, so imagine between NICE and IEEE and all the bodies that are more prominent over there, that pulling you in a different direction. It's not that we're short of them here, because I have a list between BCS, IET, IEEE UK, the Scrum, software engineering, IT architecture. I put NICE, I put ISP, I put CREST, I put the ISSA, the ISC Square. And this is just a quick look last night, honestly, 10 minutes before going to bed through Google search.
5% of it.
And if I would have needed to start my career now, looking at this, it takes you, whoa, this is very, very confusing place to be. A lot of things that I do individually is trying to help the younger generation to come into our profession, as it is a very confusing place. And I believe that awareness as a whole will help all of us on the individual level up to the enterprise and government. This is my personal take on that. But when we're talking about body of knowledge, the biggest question I find myself asking is, which one is the right one? What is the right path? And I love principles and concepts that drives us into more business-like structures, which are great, but at some point, I do feel that maybe we're missing a lot of the basics in our day-to-day of assessing, of evaluating, of targeting our career path, our desires and ambitions towards moving forward. So why do I want to do that? How do I get there? And what are the things that are going to give me something very, very good as a base? If I'm going to use the analogy of building a house, but you need a good foundation to have it solid and staying up and running for the duration of time. And without those very, very important bases, it's extremely hard. And this is where I see the problem of the profession along the side of body of knowledge, that perhaps directing us into the end results rather than building this very solid base as it stands today. That's it for me.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of food for thought. And Jim, your thoughts?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jim Hietala with the Open Group. I guess I would say, in terms of information security and body of knowledge, there's a world of opportunity here to develop bodies of knowledge. I think our perspective in the Open Group probably is that things have gotten so broad and so deep in terms of what's required among all the roles in information security that it's probably not going to happen that you'd have one organization take all of that on. So we see an opportunity to develop bodies of knowledge around things like security architecture and quantitative risk management. We've done some work in the risk analysis area, developing something called Open Fair, which is a body of knowledge around how do you do quantitative risk analysis. And in the area of security architecture, we're collaboratively working with the SAPSI Institute to do some work around how do you do security architecture? What does it mean to be a security architect? So we very much see the opportunity being, given where we're at today versus 20 or 30 years ago, that bodies of knowledge need to encompass very specific subject areas in order to get the level of detail and the level of knowledge that's needed to be a risk analyst in today's world, for example. So I think that's where we really see things. We, in looking at the security architecture area, looked at work that had been done by ISC Squared around they have a sub-specialist certification to be a security architect. And it's literally 400 pages of very specific security control knowledge that I would say is necessary but insufficient today to really be a security architect. You need the things that you talked about around design principles for security architecture. You need to understand how that kind of control knowledge folds into things like TOGAF, which is an open group enterprise architecture development methodology, to really be able to construct security architectures that work in today's world. So we very much see the need for deep bodies of knowledge, but also to develop them collaboratively with other organizations.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. So lots and lots of good kick-off points there, which often stem around this inevitable tension you always get in business between the need to centralize things and the need to distribute things, and the concertina between the two. We've heard analogies of buildings, we've heard analogies of, you can think of it of anything, you can even think of it in terms of cooking. Do you need a Mrs. Beaton who tells you how to make the pastry, or do you need a TV chef who tells you how to expand that into something wonderful? And our world actually isn't much different. We're really talking about what are the fundamental tenets that stop our roofs falling down, and the things that everybody needs to know. To write it all down in one place would be immensely hard, but to have the basics in one place feels very important. So what I'd like to do now, while you've all been thinking about those things, is throw open to the floor, and I don't mind who kicks this off. Any questions you'd like, either points to make or questions to the panel, and let's see where we get to. We've got about 20, 25 minutes or so. Yeah, could you just say who you are? But before you do anything, we have a roving microphone, and we'll be in trouble if we don't use it because you are being filmed and we need to capture the audio as well as the video. Could you, anybody who speaks, just say who you are, where you've come from? Thank you. Gentleman here in the white shirt.
Thank you. Steve Thomas from BP. John, you talked about learning from bodies of knowledge from other parts of the IT-related worlds. I wonder what we can learn from other professions completely. So appropriately for where we are today, the analogy that immediately springs to my mind is the medical profession, where clearly there's a body of knowledge about, basic physiology and anatomy and all that goes with that. But the skills and the body of knowledge that you'd need to be, say, an obstetric surgeon is completely different from what you'd need to, an orthopedic surgeon, completely different from what you need in obstetrics, for example, or in any other branch of medicine you care to think about. And aren't we in a similar kind of place where we've got a common body of knowledge that allies us, but actually within the security profession there's a bunch of specialisms, whether it's forensic, penetration testing, auditing, information assurance, architecture. You wouldn't expect somebody to have all of those, and maybe those bodies of knowledge are in different places. Yeah,
that's a very, very good point, and which is why we built the knowledge framework, because what you can imagine is the knowledge framework is the glue between the skills framework and what we're calling the cybersecurity body of knowledge, which is actually a very logical piece of information. So the idea is that everyone in our profession should really know everything in the knowledge framework, because it's at like a level 1, level 2 type of knowledge. So there is a section on security architecture. I think it's about 5 or 6 pages long. It talks about the principles of security architecture, minimization, defensive depth, etc., etc. And then it has a number of topical references out to more detailed bodies of knowledge on that subject, including SABSA, the design patterns of the open group, and that's how it all works out, because otherwise what we were producing would have been many thousands of pages, and would just be rewriting other documents and other standards around. So for risk management, we have a description of generally what risk management's all about, mainly based on 27005. But then we point out to say, if you want to read more about a particular risk methodology, go to this one. Now, the knowledge framework is in draft form. The area that can probably be built upon more is actually where we point out to things. But we have to recognize the danger. If we point out to 100 different risk management methodologies, we're screwed. So we want to have maybe a handful or even less of the mainstream methodologies that are in use. So IRAM 2, 27005, etc.
So that all makes perfect sense, but have we looked at the medical profession, the legal profession, the accountancy profession? How do they do it?
No. The professions I looked at how they were structured was, I can't remember the exact list, I looked at about 7 or 8 different professions. So I looked at, there's a pure IT one, there was a project management one. I actually looked at CISP and how that was structured and was somewhat surprised about the lack of clarity of what it is. Because it's there really to pass exams, actually, at the end of the day. That's what it is. It's not really a body of knowledge. It's a textbook about how to pass exams. So I haven't looked at other bodies of knowledge, but I did a Google, and all the body of knowledge I could find, I raided and looked at how they were structured.
I'm not criticising. It's just there's you know, learning from a completely different profession that's been around for a long time. That might have some value.
Well, I think that the thing that I really took from these other body of knowledge, and some of them have been around for 5-10 years, was actually looking at their objectives and purposes. And the knowledge framework we've written is based on the type of typical objectives they have. And it's more than just pass an exam.
Okay. Jim, do you have a view on this?
Well, I think it's instructive to look at other professions and how they came to develop their bodies of knowledge and the relationship between a broad, a very broad body of knowledge and then the specializations underneath. And I think the medical one is a great one to look at. We've done, honestly, more work in the enterprise architecture area, looking at professionalization there and doing comparisons as opposed to information security. So there are people, and I'm unfortunately not the person in the open group, but there are people who manage our EA product portfolio, if you will, who've done those sorts of looks. So.
Okay. Can I make a point on the medical analogy? Because I think, you know, as we learned more about the body, different aspects of medicine arose and gave birth to other institutions. So, you know, neuroscience being an example, you know, of one that, for instance, creates its own body of knowledge on this. So, I think the idea that a single body of knowledge that everybody knows could be so general that it's almost of no use, but a basic expectation like having a C in GCSE maths or something like that. I suppose the question for our profession is, as we have disruptive technologies come and go, whether new bodies of knowledge emerge and how we adapt to that, or whether we paint ourselves into a corner of a rather static body of knowledge that's not appropriate for the way we see the world. So I think cloud, for instance, has changed a lot of our thinking in a fundamental way about how to operate in the wild, for instance, as opposed to how to operate in closed and tight spaces. I think also if we have a look at something like the security of the Internet of Things, we can see special interest groups developing all the time. IoT and Security Foundation, for instance, is one that's up and running. And I'm not certain that everybody working in one professional body would see themselves as really being very concerned about the design and development of the Internet of Things at a fundamental level, and how that can be sustained and made resilient into the future. Okay, so, you know, to what extent is that the body of knowledge that we need to be developing now, or to what extent do we need to be looking back, or is it simply enough to have principles and then references? How do you hold people to account with a framework as opposed to what they really need to know?
Yeah. Can I have a go?
Yeah, of course.
So I don't want to be left out, so I think as well. And it's a brilliant question. The way I see it, going back again to basics, everyone in the medical profession is expected to do the first 5 years being generalist, then they go into specialization and decide to take it further ahead or not. Sorry. We have a very similar thing in the IT profession. We all need to be IT capable in order to jump onto being a developer, being a security professional, a defender, an attacker, red, blue. Really, it's all come from a joint knowledge of we can run an operating system, throw a few commands at it, maybe work with a spreadsheet to make our management happy, and all the other really mechanical stuff that goes around the big words. But what's really, really important, and I think we're missing it a lot, we have competency framework. There's the European competency framework. I believe it's on version 3, about to hit version 4 now, which is very generalist and going up to the details. We have a specific UK framework for IT profession that gives you that baseline, and that also gives you the ability to go and branch out into your areas of interest or specialization. Depends how you want to define that. But they do exist. We probably, as an industry, are doing a very bad job of articulating it, enforcing it, and reviewing it on the right retention period. Because, being honest, I read the European Competency Framework. It's quite dry, and not all of it hits the mark. Not in my life. Maybe in yours. Maybe some of it in yours. And this is where those framework, those body of knowledge, does everyone satisfy 100% as well? Also in the medical profession. If I am a brain surgeon specializing on these little brain cells in the head, I will not be able to fix my friend's knee, even if it pay me a fortune.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Thank you.
Gentleman over here. Thank you.
Peter Hazel, I'm representing the Institute of Engineering Technology. And the reason I'm speaking now is because I can see that you have a lot of the same challenges that the Institute does. And I think that there are two issues that you're discussing here, and I might be wrong. There's the first is the assessment of competency, and then there's one of body of knowledge. Now, of course, we have a chartered route that you can take, which is the assessment of competency. Now, you can get that through a degree, master's or whatever, or you can do exams through the Institute. And that gives a base level that the person should have a ranking within the organization, excuse me, saying that they're competent. What they're competent in is another discussion. Now, I'm here because I'm part of what is called a TPN, a Technical Professional Network. And how the IT works is, the IT formed from the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. So that's our background. We're all engineers, basically. Some of the engineering is very, very, very old. Power generation hasn't changed in centuries. And I would say that's akin to your risk management, because risk management doesn't change hugely. And then you have at the other end, Internet of Things. And as an institute, we have exactly the same problem. At one end, we have the old traditional electrical engineering disciplines. And at the other end, we have IoT, because we are designing the engineering for the IoT. And the way the TPNs work is they're fairly dynamic. There's some TPNs which are established, and there's some which sort of come and go according to the technological changes. And I'm wondering whether perhaps a model like that could apply to you. Just as a suggestion.
It's interesting from the viewpoint of the IET, because I'm sure, as Nigel said, many of people in this conference will be both IET and something else, or a mix. As to how in the IET you would think that the body of knowledge that you represent either needs to cover information security or can reach out and use somebody else's. That sort of problem is quite topical at the moment. But sort of to the point, who wants to respond to Peter? John?
Well, the way the knowledge framework works right now is it takes the statements made in the skills framework and basically expands upon them. So it will, and we use the Bloom's taxonomy in terms of the words to describe it. So we're giving more precision about how you can judge whether someone's competent in that skill. So that's the first level of what the knowledge framework does. And then the knowledge framework then takes any term, like what is risk management, and another part of the document basically expands upon it and gives the principles of that particular type of discipline. And then that's when it will refer out to the other bodies of knowledge. So the aim really is to try and keep this document updated probably yearly, because we do know that some technologies and some areas will be fairly dynamic in nature, and others will be, you know, fairly static. But I think we probably will need to look at revising it yearly.
I'm thinking more of a point where you have the core knowledge, body of knowledge, but you farm out the detail to groups to look after the detail and which standards you. I mean, we have a similar problem. I mean, there are thousands of engineering standards.
Right. Yes.
You know.
Oh yes.
There are actually very few in the InfoSec world. The people who know about those standards are the people who are working in that part of the industry.
Yeah.
I don't know much about the standards to do with Internet of Things, for example, but there are people within the Institute who absolutely know those.
Yeah, there's, I mean, that's certainly an issue. And one of the things that the knowledge framework right now is basically a document. Ideally, what we would like is some form of like a wiki type of nature, whereby parts of it could be run by different people, and they could actually then manage that particular section. So there's a whole section on security architecture. There would be one or two or group of people that will look at the security architecture section and then point off to the relevant detailed documents that I've produced by the open group or whoever.
Nigel, you on this?
Yeah, I think the TPM idea, if I understand what you've described there, it hints at this connection between what people actually do and then what becomes later the body of knowledge, and so it's a rolling update. And for my time in the army, one of the issues that we always had was the difference between what people were doing on operations and what they were being taught in the colleges and training schools. You know, the doctrine was always lagging behind behind practice. Now, of course, that runs into some difficulties when you're into judging people for professional standards and all the rest of it. They'll be judged against what's in the doctrine, perhaps, rather than what is common practice necessarily. And so I think another aspect of this body of knowledge is how we try and close that gap between doctrine and practice. Yeah. Practitioners will always lead in this space because they're right at the coalface in that sense. So.
Sorry, I want to follow up on that last comment. Sorry, Jeff Halperin from Huawei Technologies, because I think that there is a structural element. There's sort of the first dimension everyone looks at, which is I guess sorry, I've got jet lag. I'm trying to think of the right words. The comprehensiveness, the completeness that we look for in a structural view. But there is the structural view around, I guess, the more of the temporal view or the implementation perspective. And where I'm coming from is that as everything has moved towards this more of a incremental digital service provider perspective, we see that the way in which you apply these bodies of knowledge has to be different. And to take a couple of steps back, the old world perspective, that waterfall monolithic perspective, is based in an investment model that begats a risk model to manage that, protect that investment, which begats an operate model, which is the silos, et cetera, et cetera. The investment model, of course, with cloud is incremental. You don't buy 2 years of stuff because, it's the old world of give me 2 years and go away, I don't want to talk to you again. Now it's penalty-free, change your mind. And that investment model means that agility is much more important, vital to enterprises than the protect the investment model was. And so the risk model, the governance models change, and therefore the operating models also have to change, which is of course what you see with DevOps and what's happening in the Valley. And from a security bodies of knowledge perspective, we need to be able to apply those bodies of knowledge much more incrementally to be able to determine, based on wiki, based on whatever, these are the bits that are important today, and how do you embed them in continuous integration pipelines, those sorts of things. So I think there is a structural element in terms of how we consume and apply the body of knowledge that has to be thought about.
I agree with that. I think that that puts us really back into those fundamental principles that give you your left and right boundaries as to where all this agility happens. And so when we talk about security by design, for instance, I think that's a fundamental set of basic ideas that would that should shape, for instance, development of IoT or DevOps or an agile projects and all the rest of it.
And I will agree that the methodology is ever evolving. We used to do CapEx, now we're doing OpEx, the business is morphing, and the rest of it. But those principles of this basic ITs hasn't changed. Those principles of basic medicine hasn't changed. It's just the way we enforce them, we utilize them, the way we structure them back into our businesses, which makes it a very interesting point for body of knowledge of, if you are a superhero red team pen tester, how much of a business savvy do you need to be? This is something which is really, really interesting, right?
But again, it's this notion of you don't want to have the enterprise carrying an elephant on its back because it can't compete. So how do we apply them? How do we know which bits to apply? That's a layer that we have to think more carefully about.
So I see the business struggles when I face daily around building a team of defenders, and it's exactly what skills, what aptitudes, where do I want them to go, what do I want them to have? And that's kind of drives my thinking process. And obviously it's all done with the alignment for the business needs. And everyone who worked with me keeps hearing me as a techie saying, but why? What's the value in it and why are we doing that? Because this is the only thing I keep running around the office and shouting. It is a big challenge. And this why drives body of knowledge, drives a lot of decision, and also drive our change in our culture, in the way we do business.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Gentleman over here.
Hi, yeah, my name is Stephen Wong. I come from Singapore. And I'm at the moment the president of an association called the Association of Information Security Professionals in Singapore. And actually just to share some experiences, because we have been through this path before. The IISP, we actually developed the Information Security Body of Knowledge back in 2009 in Singapore. It took us a lot of effort to build that, so kind of we went down that path, that journey before. And the question here is, because I understand now in the UK you're also developing this body of knowledge. And I think a gentleman over there did mention that learning from other professions. But how about cooperating with the international world? Because from what I know is that there's several countries that's also developing body of knowledge. And if everybody is doing their own in silos and just reinventing the wheel, everybody is just at the same point, whereas we work together, we may be able to move that forwards rather than, because it's a significant effort. I mean, as you mentioned quite correctly, I mean, the body of knowledge cannot be all comprising because that would be millions of pages potentially. What we have back in 2009 was something very similar to your framework, of which it points out to other body of knowledges, be it what ISC developed, what ISACA developed, because they do have their body of knowledge in each area. So now the question here is, how do we work together as an international community to represent this profession? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Jim, do you want to kick off with this one, given the Open Group must have similar internationalization issues?
Yeah, well, we do. And I think that is one of the real challenges, is how do you bring folks internationally together to collaborate on standards? We do that ourselves in most of what we do. We do events in different parts of the world to try and bring viewpoints in. We have one next week in Berlin, one of our quarterly conferences. But I will say it is a challenge to do it effectively when you're trying to build an international coalition of folks who are rallying around a single standard. You know, I don't think we have a perfect answer to how to do it, but we do the best we can, and we try and involve as many people as we can in our processes. So
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I will second that. On the ISSA front, as we mentioned, we do try to collaborate globally. Not just the European and the American chapters all comes together and trying to bring those ideas into the table. What's really, really interesting, I hope interesting is the right word for that. If we just look on the last probably couple of years with the European changes around privacy law, what we used to call DPA and soon we're going to call GDPR, that drives a very strong and a consistent effort across the industry to achieve a similar thing. So maybe and we've been debating that on IoT discussion with Nigel in the past, but maybe it's the right way to enforce that through some level of regulation, policy, compliance, in order to drive that effort in the same path on all different playing parties.
Yeah, it's certainly true that sometimes a voluntary code isn't enough. Okay, thank you. Last point then, because clock's ticking, from Andy Jones. Somebody got the mic? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Andy Jones from Information Risk Management Limited. I'm head of training and development, and I've been doing quite a lot of work with universities recently, around about a dozen universities. And what staggers me with what I'm finding is the wide differences in the application of these new cybersecurity masters and also BScs. And I was struck by one only last week that had things like networking as a third-year optional module on cybersecurity. So the students are making choices about direction without any real structure and understanding. Is the body of knowledge that is used in academia fit for purpose?
I haven't got a clue. Well, just to put my hat on, I have actually written some of the modules for one of the master's training courses, so maybe I'm not the best to talk about this. But what we're doing for the body of knowledge, several points I'll make. One of the things about the body of knowledge we want, ideally, is that everyone in our profession knows everything in our knowledge framework, right? And that includes network security, because we're expecting everyone. So we're trying to push up the boundary about knowledge of everyone that has. So that's the first, I guess, the first statement. The second is that one of the purposes of our knowledge framework is to assist in development of training material and training courses as well. So that's one of the stated goals.
Thank you. I think we have to call it a day there. Yeah. You know, we've only just touched the tip of the iceberg on this subject, and thanks for all the questions and interactions. We need to crack on, obviously, with the programme. Can I ask you to thank the panel, and thank you very much for a good opening session.